Characterization is, in a few words, making character traits apparent. In fewer words, it's character development. In a run-on sentence, characterization is designed so the viewer can learn about a character without any description from the character themselves. Instead, relying on outside creative tools to express moods, traits, views, and general aspects of said character. This happens all the time in stories. Generally, you don't have someone just explicitly say who they are and why they are important to the plot. So authors, filmmakers, and writers use implicit tools to make storytelling easier. Sometimes it can be a minor design choice. In animation, it can be the small ways in which information is expressed through the ways the characters look and move. It's the reason why lots of Disney films humanize animals. Our knowledge of different animals from our own experiences lets us assume established traits without any dialogue having to be written. Meaning, Disney can build characters around these preconceived understandings and amplify them to fulfill the needs of the story. Other times in animation, the color palette or stature, the poses or general voice acting ability can be identified by the viewer and be used to provide depth to what's shown on screen. Superman is a good example. Viewers can correlate his primary colors to that of the United States, which, within his fiction, is what he strongly represents and is associated with. Within his media, Superman is also depicted in a very authoritarian pose, designed to make the most of his top-heavy shape, which again enforces an idea in the viewer's mind of what kind of character Superman could be. Someone who's very strong and needs to display himself in a certain way to enforce his image. Other media like film or television provide characterization through stuff like set dressing, giving information about someone based on the environment around them. Maybe a filmmaker shows a character's room with empty bottles strewn around the place. Logically, and depending on our own experiences, we can tie different aspects of the scene to different traits that the character could convey, creating an image in our heads of who lives in this room. Maybe the lighting or composition or the framing of a scene could depict a more emotional side of someone in a more interesting way than them just speaking every detail of their thought process. Framing especially is what adds character to different monster movies, depicting scale and how overwhelming the creatures are. Since these movies rely on a secondary cast in order to sustain a plot, the monsters themselves have to be shown in a way that strengthens that disconnect. They hold a different level of value over the human characters, so the way they're perceived by the viewer supports that. The main usage of characterization in fiction is to get across information to the audience that wouldn't work as written dialogue. In Return of the Jedi, Luke doesn't start the scene by saying how disconnected he is with his father. The scene shows us this disconnect through the placement of the characters, while also providing background depth to enrich the viewing experience and make the viewer ask questions. The information was never stated, but clues were placed within the scene, so the audience can build their own interpretation. All of the tools I've just mentioned are incredibly valuable for visual storytelling, and each is an outlet of characterization. But all of these tools are mainly used in TV or movies. You can't translate them to novels, at least not without modifying the format, like with comic books. Books use lots of descriptive words to establish the world of the story, or to explain how someone looks, since they can't actually show that. Meaning, writers have to take a lot more care when choosing their words, since they hold so much more value than if it was a film script. Lovecraft is a good example. He's an author that's very good at characterizing his characters. H.P. Lovecraft was a talented author. He wrote a lot of stories driven by horror, and his writing inspired an entire genre of Lovecraftian horror, which is pretty creepy. Lovecraft wrote several stories and poems that are great examples of characterization within literature. Not only through specific characters, but as well as establishing perspectives of broader groups. There are two pieces of his literature I would like to talk about today. The SparkNotes version of the plot is that some thieves are trying to break into this old guy's home. But that really isn't the overall focus of the story. The point is to show the ways in which the characters interact and build off of each other. There's lots of characterizing tools used with every aspect of this short story. The people, the setting, the community of Kingsport, and how they all interact with one another. They all serve the purpose in building up the character of focus. This story is a prime example of subverting expectations, and how leaving the background of a given character vague can be used to add depth during a story's climax. Any description of the old man is from the perspective of people in the Kingsport community. An example being,
among the gnarled trees in his front yard of his aged and neglected place, he maintains a strange collection of large stones, oddly grouped and painted so that they resemble the idols of some obscure Eastern temple.
Phrasing of oddly positions the narrator as someone with little knowledge of the old man's collection and what inherent value it could have. As well as that, the words obscure Eastern temple lacks any specifics, which emphasizes how the people of Kingsport share a very limited amount of knowledge about the old man and his background.
This collection frightens away most of the small boys who love to taunt the terrible old man about his long white hair and beard, or to break the small paned windows of his dwelling with wicked missiles.
This line draws focus to the old man's appearance from an outside party, as well as showing the ill intent that some of the younger citizens of Kingsport have towards him, using the term wicked missiles as a substitute for vandalism. Later on in the story, a minor line provides some foreshadowing for future events, stating how
those who have watched the tall, lean, terrible old man in these peculiar conversations do not watch him again.
Which states some malevolent intent from the old man himself. This line gives the reader a new way to perceive this character, other than just a strange guy with some tacky lawn ornaments. During the climax of the story, this side of the elderly figure is shown, having defended himself from the people trying to break into his house, killing 2 of the thieves, and confronting the 3rd on his front lawn. The last of these criminals, Mr. Chanik, remains waiting for his assailants.
But when he looked, he did not see what he expected, for his colleagues were not there at all, but only the terrible old man, leaning quietly on his knotted cane and smiling hideously.
At this point, the juxtaposition of the old man is established. Instead of being feeble and weak, his true nature becomes apparent to the reader, without him saying anything about his true intentions. Lovecraft added a unique level of depth to the people he focused on in his stories, using the biased perspectives of other characters to depict an image of who the old man could be, using characterizing tools to make traits of the people he writes about more obvious as the story progresses. Along with short stories, Lovecraft also worked with poetry to express his creative talents. One of these poems does a great job at expressing a character's personal views, explaining how they think as a result of the world around them. This poem, titled The Conscript, is from the perspective of a man enlisted to fight in the First World War, and his thoughts on this life-changing event. The poem discusses this enlisted man's views on the political figures that forced this war onto him.
One day the men that rule us all decided we must die, else pride and freedom surely fall in the dim by and by.
This line puts this character's opinions pretty bluntly. He sees enlistment or conscription as a death sentence, which is later supported by him reiterating this point.
They told me I must write my name upon a scroll of death, that someday I should rise to fame by giving up my breath.
Again, placing focus on the result that will most likely come from this war. The fact that this soldier, whoever he may be, doesn't think he's going to survive, and that his death is the expectation and will be rewarded somehow. Later lines add depth to this thought process.
I hate no man, and yet they say that I must fight and kill, that I must suffer day by day to please a master's will.
The poem is reiterating the man's own morals, as well as showing his views on government figures, with the term master's will making it seem as if he sees himself as a slave, someone forced to fight for something he lacks any investment in. The final lines of the poem states his lack of understanding, the questions he can't get answers to, and how it's affecting him mentally as well as physically.
Each day my doom doth nearer bring, each day the state prepares. Sometimes I feel a watching thing that stares and stares and stares. I never seem to sleep, my head whirls in the queerest way. Why am I chosen to be dead upon some fateful day?
Lovecraft is using this character's perspective to talk about his views on war and the effects conscription had on people. He's also characterizing the man who wrote this poem in a way that supports his views, creating a very real person with very real thoughts who asks real questions. Questions like, what's the point of this war? Why am I expected to die for my country? Is there even a purpose? All of which are questions Lovecraft probably had in the process of writing this. Lovecraft used his talents to not only enthrall readers into his literature, but also using his talents to discuss political and societal questions through the thoughts of his characters. Characterization is the outlet for developing characters. It's used in every single form of literary expression. Different media is reliant on different tools to convey characterization. And finally, properly characterizing people in your own stories can help you express your own personal ideas and views.